So
Yeah.
just moving, I've seen this, a chap called Luke has brought up what I think is a really good and valid point, which is that government doesn't build houses. Builders build houses. And builders are commercial people, right? And that's absolutely as it should be. And they will build when, where it suits them, and it has to be profitable. I mean, there's no arguing with that point, is there, Chris?
No, and the thing is, it's got to such an extent that the 170,000 properties that were built, only 17,000 of those were built by councils. Now, why is that?
Yep.
Because councils are desperate. Okay, they're desperate looking for properties. You probably see in the news that they're stacking people in porta cabins as temporary accommodation, accommodating them in B&Bs and in Premier Inns or travel lodges, and the uproar that the council get for that, and that has been going through the roof. So the council situation of accommodating people short term, that has gone through the roof. And that's not ideal. And so people are supposed to be only in there for 8 weeks because that's what the emergency accommodation time scale is. But people are in there for 4 and 5 and 6 months because there isn't the provision. So, we're not building enough, only 170,000.
Yeah.
Councils are only building 17,000. Why are councils only building 17,000? Because it's just not economical. It's not economical to provide a rental property because if you look at what the amount of money somebody who's on benefit is going to get from the government, that just doesn't pay for a property. It's certainly not paying for one to be built in 2020's prices. So what are you going to get from the government in housing benefit? It's just not going to cover it. So they don't build them.
Well, is this the whole thing? That's one of the things that I find really strange, Chris, is when people talk about affordable housing, you've got to have affordable. I mean, I've always thought that's an oxymoron. I mean, either you can afford it or you can't. I don't get this. I think affordable housing is a euphemism for prices that are subsidized down. And I don't even understand, how does that work? To go back to Luke's point, builders talk about they've built 100 houses and 20 of them are affordable. Well, what does that actually mean?
Well, I was coming to that actually. Affordable houses, David, simply put, is another con. Okay, it's another government con on figures. To put it simply, what affordable housing is and why it came about is because the government realised this situation, that social housing, housing associations, councils weren't building properties because they just wasn't economical. Now, private builders would build them because they would build them and charge above the housing benefit rate because that's what market rent is, because that's what it costs to build a house today. Not because they want to up from a Range Rover to a Bentley or something like some people would have it told. That's what it costs to build a property today, and so they will charge more for it. So tenants are not in a good position here. Nobody's in a good position here. Tenants now have got to use their housing benefit and dig into some of the other money they get from benefit to top up that to afford what is market rent today. So what happened, to answer your question about affordable rents, was the government realized this way back, 2010, I think. The government realized this, and they had a committee, and they met, and they were consulted by the wise and the good, a lot of people from housing associations and things, and they realized that this was a situation that they weren't building because it wasn't paying. So what the government did was they implemented affordable rent. So what that means, affordable rent, and I've got an example for you here from, and these figures have been taken by a housing consultant, a housing association consultant called Joe Halewood, goes on the internet by Joe Spey, very knowledgeable guy, speaking to him recently. So what he found was in Croydon, he found that in 2018, a 3-bed house in Croydon, the LHA rate was £316. If that 3-bed house was fully occupied, those tenants would have, could be fully occupied, by a tenant, would have £316. That's the maximum. The social housing rent for these properties by housing associations, and I guess what the council would charge as well, was 167. Okay, so everybody wants to move to social housing, but of course it's not paying, is it? And housing associations can't afford to increase their stock. When they're charging £167 a week, when the housing benefit is actually twice that, is 316.
Yeah.
Okay, but 316 doesn't cover it either. 316 isn't nowhere near enough. So what the government did to encourage housing associations and councils to build more property, they realized that it was going to cost them more than £316 a week, basically, to build more property. So what they said in this Croydon example, in this 3-bed Croydon example I'm giving you, okay, varies according to different bedrooms in different parts of the country, but just to give you this one example, they allowed social housing or councils, not private landlords, okay? They allowed social housing and councils to be able to charge what they now called affordable rent. The affordable rent for that property is £427. So basically, what they've allowed housing associations, and landlords are going to be absolutely amazed and livid at this, what they allowed housing associations and councils to do is to charge, or in other words, receive housing benefit at a higher rate for a council house or a local authority property than they would if. So you have two 3-bed semis in Croydon, okay? So before 2018, these are the figure prices. Before 2018, in one of the 3-bed semis, it was privately owned by a private landlord and a tenant. The tenant would be paying, or would be having, housing benefit of £316 a month. Might be paying £340 a week. A week it is. In rent, but would have to make that up. So in the one semi, the private tenant, on housing benefit, will be having £316, and he'd have to give that to the private landlord with whatever small top up, if appropriate. But the house next door that was owned by either the council or the housing association, they would be able to, not to a current tenant that was on a social rent. Okay, they couldn't change the status of a current tenant on social rent, which was an incentive for them to evict that tenant, which is missed on a lot of tenant support groups. Okay, but more on that later. So it's actually an incentive now, because if this tenant on social rent at £100 and something a week goes, then the following Monday they can issue an affordable rent tenancy and get housing benefit or universal credit of £427. So in other words, the taxpayer is paying more for housing benefit to house somebody in social housing or council housing than they are to house somebody in a private landlord's property.
So when it comes to the private landlord, then what does this all mean then?
Well, the private landlord is getting squeezed out, because the cost of property is increasing for everybody. It's no cheaper for social housing or council housing to build a new 2-bed, 3-bed property than it is for a private landlord. It's the cost of the land and the bricks and mortar. Yeah. But the private landlord's only being able to receive, or the private tenant is only able to receive £316 a week. But a tenant next door in social housing or a council house can have 427. Now, this rate around the country, okay. In fact, a tenant support group, Shelter, they did a study around the country, and they looked at what was the market rate, what was the market rent, okay, and they found that 97% of the country, that housing benefit didn't come up to the market rent. Now, there's no surprise when you think that for 4 years, the government froze local housing allowance. They froze it. So as naturally all other prices were increasing, and also during this time, 2016, 2015, for 4 years, we had this housing benefit freeze. What happened around that time for 6 years also was austerity. You remember austerity, David? It was when everybody's pay was frozen apart from MPs, if you remember that, right? So that's, we had that austerity. So everybody was financially affected, but of course didn't stop prices going up. Nothing stops prices going up. You can have austerity, you can choose whatever housing benefit rate, but the cost of bread and fuel and building properties, you can't legislate against that.
No, I mean, it's something, Chris. A long time ago, when I was at university and I was an economist, I did economics. That was my chosen sphere. But the most basic rule in economics, it is the iron law of supply and demand. You can't get around it. Socialists might like to. It's impossible. And as you say, regardless of everything else that you tinker with and mess about with, that iron law always continues. What is the supply? Yeah. What is the demand? Simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah, private renting has been, all renting's been increasing because, austerity, people can't afford to buy their own homes. The latest government con is help to buy. Okay, well, is it a con? Well, look, any help to somebody to get on the housing ladder is obviously got to be welcome. But, we're talking about a cupful. We're trying to fit these 3 gallons into a 2-gallon bucket, and the government say, "I got a cup full here." Well, it's just not gonna cut it, David.
No.
You got basically private landlords, 2.5 million of them. You got 4.5 million or 4.7 million private tenants. You've got about, I think, is it 4 million social tenants? There's slightly more private rented tenants than there are social tenants, okay?
Yeah.
But social landlords, now private landlords getting all the stick for being nasty and evicting tenants who can't pay and things like that. Heaven forbid, you should be able to have something without paying. But they get all this flack for evicting people. But actually, social landlords evict 4 times as many tenants as private landlords do. And there's less social tenants.
Yeah, but I mean, the one thing, Chris, that for the last, I'd say at least the last 10 years, the successive governments have absolutely demonized private landlords. They paint them as vultures, ripping off people, charging extortionate amounts of money, putting people in substandard accommodation. I mean, honestly, private landlords have had worse press than COVID in many regards. And I find this really strange because the same people provide a very important service to, as you say, millions of tenants.
Well, 84% of tenants are satisfied with private renting. Now, you can't say 84% of the public are satisfied with MPs. You'd be hard pushed to find 16 MPs you'd be satisfied with, let alone 84% of them.
I can't find any.
So, you've got a very high level of satisfaction, especially given the climate, a very high level of satisfaction, a very low eviction rate, and yet all the focus, by tenant support groups is on the 2% of tenants that landlords have to evict. It's not on, on the 4 times that many that social landlords are evicting. It's not on the higher rent that social landlords are charging. We're not really charging the tenants because they're getting it paid in housing benefit. The taxpayer is losing. Tenants are losing. There's hundreds of millions of pounds of housing benefit paid direct to tenants but don't get passed on to landlords. And, the government and the Department of Work and Pensions through Universal Credit, they're not interested in it at all. Now they should be interested. The government should be interested in paying money for one reason and it not ending up. Because sooner or later, what happens, David, is that the private landlord has to evict that tenant because they're not passing the rent on naturally. they have to evict that tenant, and then they go through all the costs and the expense of that and what have you. So that then that person then goes to the local authority and has to take up 6 months of a travel lodge hotel or a porta cabin, you know, and prey on their emergency accommodation and burden the local authority. Now, they don't have a duty to provide accommodation where the person has been evicted for not paying rent. But the problem is if that family has been evicted, has got a child, then they have to by default, because they can say to the parents, well, we're not going to provide accommodation for you, but they'd have to accommodate the child. And the thing is, it would cost 3 times as much to pay for accommodation and care for the child, aside from the obviously it not being in the best interest of the child and not being a child's fault that the parents hadn't paid the rent. But you know, economically, it's not viable for the local authority to use that when you've made yourself intentionally homeless, because they're gonna have to pick up the cost, you know. And I say it's taxpayer. So anybody watching this who's not a landlord needs to be really concerned about all this, because it's their taxes that are paying for this. It's their taxes that are paying more in rent for social housing and housing associations. It's their taxes that are paying for people to receive housing benefit and just, you know, and buy something else out of it and not pass it on to the landlord and then get burdened on the local authority and cost the local authority, in other words, more taxpayers' money to have to, you know, go through the washing cycle again.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds an absolute mess. So, okay, Chris, we've identified all that's wrong with it, right? We're clear that there's a lot of things wrong. What do we need to do to make things right?
Well, look, we could have a couple of hour sessions on that, David. what I'm saying, okay, my point is this: is that the whole reason for it is demand. This is like a 2-sentence summary of what I'm saying this evening. The whole point of it is demand, and for starters, nobody's acknowledging that. So if the government are not acknowledging it because they're afraid to acknowledge it, because it involves immigration, which involves race, you know, which is totally taboo. You know, first person to mention a word gets a card to go to the races, or a race card I get mixed up. I'm not really interested, but you know, first person. So it's a taboo subject, even to the extent, like I said, of that. Yeah. You know, if we've got thousands of kids, thousands of girls being raped in one town, and across the country, that equates to hundreds of thousands of teenage girls being raped, and the government won't do anything about that, and will shelve that, and will bury that. Are they going to do anything about housing? But you know, there's a professor of demography in Oxford, and he reckons that by 2040, we're going to be up at 80 million population in this country. We're 67 now.
Yep.
By 2060, he says, now make of this what you will, but by 2060, immigration will have got to the extent that white Europeans will be in the minority in this country. Now, think what you like about that, okay? Be totally happy with it, or otherwise. But what in relation to housing, the point I'm making in relation to housing is that, you know, we can't cope now. We couldn't cope 10 years ago. We've just been bumbling around. You know, people have been losing accommodations, sofa surfing, you know, and all the rest of it, because we've got more people coming in than we can house. We can't house 313,000 people a year when we are only providing a fraction of that in accommodation, and when it costs that much to provide it.
And I mean, Mr. Joe Cool here says demographics are your destiny, and you're right, Joe, about that. And like that 80 million figure that you mentioned there, Chris, as a putative UK population in about what 30, 40 years or whatever. I mean,
no, less than 20 years, 2040.
20 years, yeah. So who knows? I might even still be around by that point.
But it's going to come a lot sooner, you see, David, because that's just taking known immigration figures, and that's just running the numbers. Well, we know that we know we've got unknown figures. We know that if they can count 313,000, we know that there's more. There's at least that. So we know there's more than it. Look, I'll give you an example of that. They reckon that there was 4,000 rough sleepers. Okay, only 4,000 rough sleepers. Okay, I think there's that many in London, but that was the number of rough sleepers that the government quoted for the whole country. Now, when COVID came, we had the all-in. So we had all the rough sleepers, accommodated, in March and things like that in travel lodges and B&Bs. How many people did they end up accommodating? 29,000. I mean, what's the saying? Lies, damn lies, and government figures, isn't it, or something like that?
So yes, that's a good statistic. So 4,000 approximate figure, reality 29,000. That's out by a scale of around about
7-1. So when we talk about 2040, it ain't going to be 2040. It's going to be more like 2030, 2035 at the latest. And so we got to look at demand, and it's the same with motorways, the same with hospitals and everything else. And if we just ignoring that, and we just afraid to mention the word, and we can't even have an honest conversation about it, well, what chance have we got? All we're doing is, we're saying, this private rented bucket, it needs an electrical certificate. Or, this bucket is overflowing in some areas because of demand. The housing situation in some areas is overflowing in terms of demand. So what we'll do is we'll make all the properties in that area have a license. And so we'll make the landlords pay £1,000 every 5 years for a license. Well, the way business works, David, basically, 101, business gets a cost. Well, guess what happens to that cost? And then the government wonder why rents are going up. And then at the same time they wonder why rents are going up, okay, they'll also bring in affordable rents to allow social housing and councils to have more rent than they're allowing the market.
It's madness, isn't it? I mean, this is madness. And the thing is, it's not going to end well, is it? Because this is going to build up, and it must already be building up in certain areas, huge frustrations.
You got landlords exiting the market. Now there'll always be more landlords coming into the market, but net figures, it is slowly contracting. Okay, slower than what was thought, but it's slowly contracting. You're always going to get new landlords coming in because your mods are always going to die. You're always going to have this 50%. People who are 15 now, in 30 years' time, when a relative dies, they're going to inherit the house. So you're always going to have new landlords, and you're always going to have about 50%. You're always going to have these people being landlords. The government don't like that. They see them as accidental, as single entities. Well, perhaps they are, but the government aren't helping in the amount of regulation and red tape that they're creating. And to some extent, if I'm honest, landlords need to also, the single landlords need to put a bit more upskilling into their game in terms of regulation. But it is just the figures are just going downhill fast, David.
Well, actually, I'll just put this comment up because it's quite interesting from Billy. He says, you're not wrong. Can you believe that house prices are still going up? And that's with the economy shut down. So if I mean, there's a big if in this one, mind you, but if we ever get out of lockdown and all of that, then the likelihood is that what you're talking about gets worse, Chris, because pricing will go up and up and up. Yeah. The demand continues to increase because that tap is not going to be turned off. I mean, I read today that I think 13 new arrivals by dinghy appeared on our southern coast. Well, I mean, those people are probably going to be staying here. That's 13 people. I wasn't sure if they were socially distanced in the dinghy, by the way, but leaving that to one aside. But yeah, I mean, as you said, so you've got a perfect storm here, haven't you, really? Everything's going in kind of the wrong direction.
Absolutely, David, and the word "perfect storm" is a good description of it. Look at we talked about all this huge demand and this 313,000 immigration. It was slightly less last year. It's not going to be less than 330 next year. It's going to be, slightly more. But Hong Kong, the government have envisaged that in the next 5 years that we'll be taking 300,000 Hong Kongers. Well, that is equivalent to one whole year's worth of immigration, extra over and above what we will normally take. And you're just going to go from 30 people chasing a house and 29 people being disappointed to 49 people chasing a house, or 50 people chasing a house and 49 being disappointed. And I mean, there's the sofa surfing and the cardboard box and bench sleeping, is going to go like that. And socially, it's just, we're going to be, the benefit payments are going to be going like that. It's just not going to end well. All that's happening is tinkering around the edges, bringing in electrical certificates, bringing in landlord licensing, taking 200,000 rooms out of the equation. No, that was a real brainstormer. That was,
Yeah. And this all happened under the tutelage of a so-called conservative government as well.
Labour's plans were a lot worse, would you believe?
No, I wouldn't be surprised about that, but yeah.
If they could be worse, David, they're bad enough. But if they could be worse, they would be under Labour.
Yeah, well, I don't doubt that. But I think that one of the fundamentals here then is that until the tap is turned off, then in terms of immigration, then unfortunately, because a consequence of that, the demand is always going to exceed supply, and that's always going to pressurize. And you combine that then with a growing population, although that demographic is a different matter, but nonetheless, a growing population. And we are heading for, we're going to go over the cliff at some point in the next 10 years, aren't we?
Well, absolutely. It's this talk about rent control and rent capping because there's that concern about rents going up. What's going to happen if we're going to have an economics 101 year? But what's going to happen if the government were to turn around to bakers and say you can only charge 40 pence a loaf, right? Well, first of all, the bakers would say, what the hell do you think you're doing trying to tell me what I can and can't do in business with? Although that's what's happening with landlords, okay? But secondly, let's say that happened. Well, what would start to happen now? Let's see. Well, the loaves would start getting smaller, like your marathon and your Mars bars, or your Snickers and your Mars bars. Show my age for marathons. But so they'll start getting smaller. So your loaf of bread will end up like that instead of like what it is now. And then the quality of the bread is going to be awful. But then slowly, less bakers are going to start baking that bread because they're not getting the monetary return for it. And so they're going to bake other stuff instead. And so, you're going to find a shortage of bread. Well, it's what's happening with housing. You try and regulate a business and, you get a knock-on effect. What they do on one thing affects something else, which affects something else. You couldn't trust them to run a sweet shop.
No, well, of course, most of them have never run anything, and that's sort of evident. And it is sad to see, in particular, private landlords who as a vast majority, as you say, are just ordinary people, Chris, trying to do something for their future, so that that they have something to fall back on in when tough times come. And yet, I think they've been almost, along with the driver, by the way, government demonizes the driver, but they've demonized private landlords now to the point where I often think, unless you're gifted it as a consequence of a relative dying, why would you bother going into it? Why would you take all the hassle? I remember, I'll just sort of a quick personal story. I actually did for a while have a property which I was a landlord of, and I can remember, and this was in the university area of Belfast, which some people on the stream may know. And I remember we were going off for a week's holiday somewhere back in the days when people could go on holidays, Chris. We were getting on a flight to somewhere sunny, and my wife's phone went. and it was one of the people that were renting out the property, and there was a problem with the dishwasher or something like that there. And I remember looking at my wife and thinking, hang on a second, this is just not fun. You know, there's so much pressure on us, is what I'm trying to say. So we got out of it, we flogged it, and got rid of it, and bye. But yet I know that other landlords who are very diligent and do the right thing and do look after their tenants, but nonetheless, Chris, they have been demonized. It's increasingly financially less attractive because of the way government's approached it as well, isn't it? I mean,
they see it as a golden goose. You know, they want their share. You know, they want their 2 pennies worth, and they've been doing that with tax and by reducing tax allowances and by increasing tax takes and things, and you know, by totally treating landlords differently to anything else in terms of, you know, allowing costs, business costs. I used to train landlords, and I used to explain the Section 24, the Finance Act, to them in this very peculiar way, David, because I like to explain things in a peculiar way. You know, the way Section 24, the tax system, works on landlords is that it prevents private landlords from being able to claim interest on a business loan. In other words, a mortgage. So if you have a business loan to buy a tractor or whatever else, you know, a van, if you're a carpenter or whatever, of course that's a business cost, isn't it? Yeah, so the cost of a mortgage to buy a house to rent out is a business cost in housing terms. But they treated landlords totally, and only landlords, totally distinct from any other kind of business expense, and said your expenses now, your mortgage costs, are not going to be allowed. Okay, so you're going to have to pay tax on all your mortgage. But that was only for residential property. So the example I used to give people when I was train landlords and tell them this story is, if you go and buy a house, a semi-detached house, and you were to operate a legal brothel from it, because you can operate legal brothels, okay? And the semi-detached next door, we both bought these properties now for £200,000. I got a mortgage for £200,000, and you got a mortgage for £200,000, okay? Now, you can claim the interest on your mortgage for it, because you're not using it for residential letting. So you can run your brothel and claim your tax back on your mortgage, but I'm letting it to a family who desperately need it because they're one of the 29, you know, that I've given the property to. But I can't offset my taxes. So they're living next door to a brothel where you were able to claim your mortgage interest rate, and I can't. So I'm not going to be able to afford to run that property. So I'm going to sell it, or I'm going to use it for Airbnb, or I'm going to use it for holiday letting, or businesses can be quite creative when they're forced to be. They don't want to be, but when they're forced to be, they can be quite creative. And then when they run out of creative strategies, then they exit the market, like you say, and and then there's this allegation that, well, landlords are actually stopping first-time buyers from getting on the property land because they're buying up properties to rent, and they can afford to pay more for them because they're already established and they're not like on the bottom rung of the ladder. But that, like anything could be true. Like you say, well, look, there's Bentleys or Range Rovers on the road. Well, there are some, but they're not full of bloody Bentleys, are they? So, the thing is with these landlords, it's just not the case. It's not the case on the whole. What the type of property that landlords want are properties that need a lot of work doing to them, that need a lot of renovation, and so therefore they will be cheaper, but they're not the property that a first-time buyer will need, because you'll need to find £50,000 to renovate it. And so a first-time buyer can't afford to pay the mortgage for that and not live in it for 6 months because it's being knocked about and being totally renovated, and they don't have the spare £50,000 to pay to renovate it. And so, or a landlord will buy somewhere that's going to be a shared house, to provide 5 or 6 rooms and to accommodate 5 or 6 different people, which is what's wanted. It's what's wanted. But all the effort and the focus against landlords is against landlords to a large measure who are providing houses of multiple occupation by licensing and by removing tax and things. And so, the government by its actions are not helping landlords to provide vital accommodation that's desperately needed.
I think we can conclude that the private landlord, generally speaking, are people much more sinned against than sinning, and the government, as from everything we've chatted about during this, the government is actually making a bad situation worse. And unfortunately, Chris, if I understand a lot of what you've said, the times ahead are going to get tougher and tougher unless government actually faces up to the problems that you've specified and actually deals with them. So look, I think you've spoken up very eloquently, Chris, on something which, frankly, on this channel, we can talk about lots of things. We can talk about COVID. We can talk about all kinds of topics, let's say. But something as fundamental as housing does need to be aired. So I'm really pleased that you've taken this time, Chris, this evening to come onto the stream. I hope you'll come back onto the stream, by the way, because this issue isn't going to go away. And, there's been so many different aspects to this we haven't had time to actually really go into. But look, I want to thank you, Chris, first of all, for being with us tonight. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here. I want to thank the people on the stream for all your comments. If you're watching this in replay, don't forget to leave the comments down below, and so I can read them. And that's it from me for tonight. I'm not sure if I'll be back or not this week live, but there's the daily videos which you can watch on all the different channels, so you can see that from me then. So look, yes, just a few comments, some nice comments there. I see Chris coming up, and yes, as I say, I'm very keen on the stream. Sorry, to tackle just fundamental stuff. It's not. It shouldn't be complicated, but it is. Because government makes things complicated. One of the reasons I'm such a critic of big government. Thanks, and thanks for the kind words, Harry, City Troll. Thank you guys for being with us all, and thanks again, Chris. And that's it from me for tonight. Adieu. We shall speak soon. Goodbye, everybody.